For many years, it's been clear that the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay does not advance our national security. It undermines it.
As the sun starts to set in U.S. President Barack Obama's final term, why has he been unable to fulfill his promise to close the prison at Guantanamo Bay? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. Guantanamo Bay has been a thorn in the U.S. president's side since he took office in 2008. A major campaign promise to close the prison there has fallen flat. Here now with the latest on the efforts and the resistance to closing the prison, CCTV's Jim Spellman. And Jim, where does the president's push to close Guantanamo stand today?
Hey, Anand. So back in February, Obama laid out a plan to close Gitmo by the end of his term in office next January. So of the 80 remaining detainees, most would be sent back to their home countries or to a third country like Oman, which has taken a handful of prisoners originally from Yemen. Yemenis make up about half of the remaining detainees. The most dangerous prisoners, perhaps about 10 detainees, would be moved to the United States. The administration has assembled a list of 13 potential destinations within the U.S., mostly maximum security prisons and military bases.
Now, there has been resistance in Congress to the president's plans. How are they reacting to this latest plan?
Yeah, absolutely. This week, the Republican-led House of Representatives in the U.S. Congress passed a defense policy bill that would continue to bar the U.S. from moving any prisoners at Gitmo into the United States. This provision has been one of the things preventing President Obama from making good on his campaign pledge to close Guantanamo Bay. The U.S. Senate will take up its version of the bill in coming weeks. The administration is threatening to veto the bill if it makes it to the president's desk, but by attaching these provisions to this much larger defense bill makes it more politically difficult for the president to veto it. But even if these so-called high-value detainees like alleged 9/11 mastermind Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, known as KSM, do make it onto U.S. soil, that's just where the complications will really begin. KSM, captured in 2003, subjected to what many consider torture, including waterboarding, before being transferred to Gitmo in 2006. Now, since then, a long series of hearings, tribunals have failed to produce a trial or, of course, a verdict. Those issues will only become more complicated if KSM or these other detainees step foot on U.S. soil, where defendants are afforded many more legal rights than the detainees at Guantanamo Bay have been enjoying over the last decade or so, Anand.
And Jim, is it likely that we could see the closure of this prison before President Obama leaves office?
Well, the clock is simply running out. If this defense bill passes, the administration's only option would be to transfer detainees like KSM to another country, which they have been extremely reluctant to do, or to move them to U.S. military facilities outside the U.S. would really just be a symbolic gesture at best. Looking ahead to the presidential election later this year, Republican candidate Donald Trump pledging to keep Gitmo open. He says he will even add more detainees. Democrats Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders are both vowing to close the facility. They'll face the same obstacles Obama has. And as perhaps an indication that Gitmo will be there for some time to come, within just the last month, the base there started publishing its own magazine. It's called The Wire. It has articles including how to deal with stress for the military members and how to work on gardening while you're stationed there at Guantanamo Bay, Anand.
Right, gardening in Guantanamo. Thanks, Jim. That's CCTV's Jim Spellman reporting. Joining me now via Skype from Birmingham in England is Mozhem Beg. He is a former Guantanamo Bay detainee. He was imprisoned in 2002 and released in 2005. Mozhem, thanks for joining us. Let me ask you first, what were the circumstances that led to your imprisonment at Guantanamo Bay?
I was essentially kidnapped, taken at gunpoint by U.S. forces along with Pakistani intelligence agents, I think, and U.S. intelligence agents from my house in Pakistan in 2002 in front of my wife and children. I had been living in Pakistan after I evacuated from Afghanistan, where we'd been living, working on a project to build a school in Wales. And I was taken without any legal process, literally bundled into the back of a car, taken off to some secret locations, and then sent in various stages, first of all to the US detention facility in Kandahar, then Bagram, and then eventually Guantanamo, where I remained for 2 years without charge or trial, and was released in 2005 to my native United Kingdom and returned home to my family.
Did the people who captured you tell you why they were doing what they were doing? Did they say that they would bring charges against you? Did they give you any reason?
Yes, of course, this was all in the wake of September 11th. Remember, this was 2001, they, meaning the US military and this intelligence services and secret services, were looking for anybody who might be connected to in any way at all those who were responsible. The problem was that after 9/11, everybody was deemed to be responsible in one way or the other, and that's why hundreds and thousands of people were detained. They accused me of being a member of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, though they didn't say how, where, who, when, with, or why I was. There was no evidence produced for that, despite the fact that I was tortured over a period of 3 years by these very secret agencies, the CIA, the FBI, military intelligence. And in the end, of course, after all of that process of hundreds of interrogations, there were no charges, even though the Guantanamo Military Commission's process has such a low standard of evidence that even hearsay evidence is introduced. There is no jury process and so on. Even despite that, there were still no charges. So really, in the end of it, I don't know why they held me, other than just because they could.
Now, you were held initially, as you point out, in Afghanistan, then at Guantanamo Bay. What were conditions like at these prisons?
They varied, but in all honesty, I think, and I've seen prisons in the UK and elsewhere, I think there's no comparison. These were military prisons. People were beaten to death. I saw two prisoners being tied up with their hands above their head to the top of a cage like this, and suspended for hours on end, as they had done to us. And they were beaten physically until the point at which they were no longer alive. Some were kicked, some were punched, it was a process that was outside of the rule of law. There was no accountability for anybody. We prisoners were not afforded any of the Geneva Conventions or any of the rights of prisoners, even in third world countries. So essentially, America was operating outside of the rule of law. There were some decent American soldiers. There were people who did befriend us, who did treat us well. But the system was designed to destroy us. And it's little wonder that at least 9 people are reported to have committed suicide in Guantanamo during this time.
How were you treated?
As I said, it varied from time to time. Over a period of 3 years, there was some periods that were very difficult. In, for example, Bagram, where I was held by the Americans, they threatened that if I didn't cooperate, they would send me to a third world country, to either Syria or to Egypt, to be tortured. If I didn't cooperate, they had myself with my hands tied behind my back to my legs, being hogtied in a cell while they subjected me to the sounds of a woman screaming next door in a room that they led me to believe was my wife, while they waved pictures of my children in front of me, saying, "Where do you think they are? Do you think you're going to see them again? What do you think happened to them the night that we took you away from them?" And sort of, there was a mix of physical and psychological torture. But as I have to say, also, there were decent American soldiers who didn't like what was taking place, who were appalled at our behavior, who tried to do something about it, but they were sadly in the minority.
These soldiers that carried out this kind of, the treatment that you underwent, were they supervised in any way? What about their commanders? Were they aware of what was going on?
Yeah, it's important to understand that people were treated according to, there was a link between the intelligence services and the military. The military's job was just to hold us. The intelligence services was to try to extract and garner information from us. So the CIA or the FBI would interact with the military and say that if these guys don't cooperate, and they're not cooperating with us in the interrogation, then you treat them accordingly. So if you don't cooperate, food will be withheld, medical services will be withheld, and you'll be treated badly. But if you cooperate, you'll get a little bit better of a deal.
Did you have access to an attorney?
Of course, for the first 2.5 years, up until, I think, September 2004, nobody had access to any attorneys at all. So we were sitting in limbo. We didn't know what our rights were because we were essentially given no rights. We were told by the United States military in the beginning that you are now the property of the United States of America and you have no rights. But essentially, after a legal ruling in Russell versus Bush, a case against the US for our detentions, lawyers were allowed to come to Guantanamo to meet with us in order that we could present our cases to the US courts to argue that we either be presented to the court or released. But of course, most people know, nobody's ever been released from Guantanamo as a result of any legal proceeding. There's always been diplomatic discussions, but nobody's left as a result of any legal ruling that is recognized.
And did you tell your attorney about the way in which you were being treated while being held?
Yes, I did, and essentially I think that's one of the things that happened is that within the British society at least, when that story started getting out and becoming prominent and known, and I'd even written some letters through some sympathetic guards, these letters were then read out in the British Parliament, in the British media, and they said simply this, that I have committed no crime, they've never charged me with a crime, I've witnessed deaths, I've witnessed murders here, and I've been mistreated, and so I told all of this to the lawyers. The lawyers, normally their place is to operate within the courts of law, but there were no courts of law, so they had to operate in the court of public opinion, which was in the media, and then eventually that embarrassment led to the British government, which was the closest with the Americans, to say that if you can't treat our citizens in accordance with international law, then you need to return them, and eventually that's what happened.
Did you receive any kind of compensation from the United States, or even an apology for being incarcerated?
No, the United States official position has never been, they've never apologized to anyone, they've never given compensation to anyone, despite the fact that detentions have been illegal. The British government, I have to say, were complicit in my case. The British government, I believe, were the reason I went to Guantanamo was because of the British government, not the Americans. It was all the false information that my own government had given. So my compensation that I won eventually in 2010 was from the British government for being complicit in torture, false imprisonment, and kidnap. But as far as the Americans are concerned, they've not allowed any case to be taken against US officials at all. And that remains the case. And it is a travesty of justice because the majority of the people in Guantanamo had nothing to do with terrorism or 9/11, and that's been proved beyond any doubt.
President Obama promised to close Guantanamo when he was campaigning to become president. It still remains open. Are you surprised?
I believe Obama was probably sincere in his desire to close Guantanamo. He's been blocked several times. He's said again and again he wants to empty the place, but the problem really is that the handful of people who might have been involved in 9/11, there are one or two who have said that they were tortured before they even got to Guantanamo. So the moment that you try to take these individuals onto US soil, you can't prosecute them because they'll be based on torture evidence. The cases will be thrown out. So you have to keep them in Guantanamo. There's nowhere else you can take them. And the problem with that is that then they stay there in limbo without charge or trial. So this is one of the marks against America. You should never have tortured your prisoners because then you could have prosecuted them if you wanted to. So the truth is Obama could have said one simple thing because he's a constitutional lawyer. He knows better. He knows that there's a presumption of innocence in Western countries. He could have said these men are innocent before the law, and he's never said that. If he had said that, then there could be no way to keep Guantanamo open. But Congress keeps blocking any measures to really close the place or to have any of the trials moved over to American soil.
What kind of impact has this had on your life?
Well, I say often that I've never been to America in my life. America has been to me. And it's shown me a face of it that I had an idea that existed, but I didn't really know for sure. And what I witnessed was the ugly side. That's all I've seen of America. All I've seen of America is Bagram, Guantanamo, and the US detention process. I've never seen anything else of it. So it was a really, really bad PR exercise. And if I can say this as a British citizen who understands Western culture, imagine the impact that Guantanamo has had on Tunisians, on Afghans, on Turks, on all of the 40 nations where people came from that were affected by this. They've never been to America either. And the collective view of America now has spread around the world. That America claims to be this bastion of democracy, freedom, and human rights. But look at Guantanamo, that turns everything on its head.
Mozhem Beg, thanks so much for joining us. We are going to take a break right now. Coming up, why does the US military prison at Guantanamo Bay remain open despite political promises to close it? We'll have the view from Cuba and the US next. Stay with us, you're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about the U.S. prison at the Guantanamo Bay Naval Air Station on the island of Cuba. The prison remains open today despite President Obama's commitment to closing it. Joining us now, Gideon Abbas is a human rights attorney and activist. Gideon, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Closing the prison was one of President Obama's big election promises, but as I mentioned, it still remains open. Why has it been so difficult to close this prison?
President Obama hasn't been able to close this prison because President Obama has never really tried to close it. He's only really tried to move the prison to the continental United States. And part of the reason why the idea of Guantanamo Bay is still strong and still supported by all of the Republican presidential candidates is because the United States has come up with this idea that they need to abandon the rule of law for a class of prisoners. And that idea has been discredited by the passage of time. There have been 800 people that have been detained at Guantanamo Bay. More than 600 have been released thus far, and that's a 75% wrong rate. There are people that are now detained in Guantanamo Bay. Of the 91 that are left, about a third have, in the United States' eyes, have no reason to be detained further. But the United States sought a place where it could torture people and interrogate people outside of what it wanted to be the jurisdiction of federal courts. The U.S. courts, to some of its credit, has discredited that idea, but Guantanamo Bay continues to exist because no one has been held accountable for its extrajudicial actions of torture and unlawful detention.
Right, and does the administration here have a point when it says U.S. law doesn't apply there? I mean, what's the legal basis for that?
The Supreme Court held about a decade ago that the Guantanamo Bay facility is within the jurisdiction of the U.S. courts. But it says something about the U.S. system of justice that the prior administration, the Bush administration, deliberately sought a location on Guantanamo Bay for the purpose of evading jurisdiction. That argument did not work in court, but what we've had since then is an ongoing debacle where the United States sets up an unlawful system of adjudicating the claims against the people held at Guantanamo Bay. Courts find those systems to be unlawful for a variety of reasons, and on it goes. And so far, the overwhelming majority of people at Guantanamo Bay, even in the United States government's eyes, are innocent of wrongdoing. And that's why we have a criminal justice system. We have a criminal justice system to provide a check on the United States executive branch. Without that check, the executive branch will always make mistakes, and they'll always err on the side of depriving innocent people of their rights.
So let's look at some of the political and security implications of this prison. It's this prison that's in Cuba. Critics of this prison say that it's actually acted as a big recruitment poster for militant groups that want to recruit members. When they look at what's going on there and what we're hearing, I mean, it's easy for them to demonize the United States as being this Islamophobic nation that's imprisoning people without trial, without charges, etc. I mean, do they have a point?
Of course. There was a New York Times columnist years ago that once commented on the two-tier system of justice in the United States. There's one for Muslims and one for non-Muslims. And the Guantanamo Bay adjudication system is an example of the crown jewel of that two-tiered system. Of course, the Guantanamo Bay is a recruitment tool for enemies, but that's not the only reason why it should be abandoned. It should be abandoned first and foremost because our greatest bulwark against our enemies is not torturing people in a facility that we acquired because of Cuba being a small nation and us being able to take some of their land. Our system of justice is what we're fighting for, and we should advocate for the application of the rule of law even against these unpopular, scary people in Guantanamo Bay.
There's been a lot of controversy, of course, over this prison and the people being held there. I want you to take a listen to what the commander of the guard force at the prison camp, U.S. Army Colonel David Heath, had to say about the prison and the people being held there. Let's watch.
I treat them the way I would want to be treated if I was a prisoner of war or whatever. So that's what I emphasize with my guards and insist that that's how we behave here. We don't abuse people here. We don't torture anyone. We don't. I don't go out of my way to make people miserable.
What do you make of that?
Well, it's ludicrous that there's only 10 people in Guantanamo Bay that are even facing charges. The plan for many of the rest is to just hold them without charge indefinitely forever. While the rough edges of the Guantanamo Bay endeavor have been shaved off, the enduring injustice of Guantanamo Bay has been and is now the indefinite detention of people that have not been charged with any crime. And 800 people have been detained without, almost 800 people have been detained without any charges at all, and that is something that should bother us all.
Very quickly, 5 seconds I have. Do you believe that Guantanamo will be closed down by President Obama, or will it just continue?
Guantanamo Bay will continue, unfortunately, until the foreseeable future.
Gideon Abbas, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We are going to take a break right now. Up next, the Guantanamo Naval Air Station is on the island of Cuba, which some Cubans see as a violation of their sovereignty. We'll have the Cuban view right after the break. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about Cuban sovereignty in the debate over closing the prison at Guantanamo Bay. Joining me now from San Diego, Carlos Alzugare is a former Cuban ambassador to Belgium and Luxembourg and a longtime teacher and professor. Professor, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you about Guantanamo.
Now, how does Cuba view the continued U.S. presence in Guantanamo, not just as a prison, but also as a naval air station? Does it in any way compromise Cuba's national security?
It is illegal, and it is, of course, it is a complication for our national security because it is a foreign territory occupied, in our opinion, illegally by the United States inside Cuban national territory, and it has always been a concern that something might happen. In the past, something on purpose, more recently, something as an accident that will unleash a war between the two countries. Now, that seems a long way now that President Obama has taken the steps of starting a process of normalization of relations with Cuba, and that we have normal diplomatic relations. But still, it is, and it is an insult. It's a permanent reminder to all Cubans about the fact that the United States, in the early years of Cuban independence, was able to control Cuba and to impose on Cuba a treaty like the one that they imposed on Cuba about Guantanamo. This is a treaty without an expiration date. Nobody in its right mind would lease any property without an expiration date. So that really makes it very clear that it was extracted from Cuba under duress, under pressure from the big country that was treating Cuba like a small country where the United States could do everything they wanted.
Have there been any discussions with the United States on the ultimate status of the territory and, of course, of the prison itself?
Well, the prison is not our concern. We share the world opinion and a great part of American opinion that the prison is a blemish in the American side because it is a place where torture has taken place, where people have been detained for years without any trial. So we share that view, but of course we think that the United States has to close down the prison camp, but of course it is a question of American politics. Now the next step after closing down the prison camp is starting negotiations with Cuba to return the territory to Cuba as it should be, because everybody recognizes, including the Supreme Court, that Guantanamo is Cuban sovereign territory. So it should be returned to its sovereign owner as soon as the sovereign owner wants it returned. And for most Cubans, not only for the government, for the Cuban people, that was yesterday. The territory should have been returned yesterday, if you get what I mean.
Now, as we see diplomatic relations being restored, as we see a normalization of relations between Cuba and the United States, do you think that all the major obstacles that stand in the way of this territory being handed back to Cuba being removed?
Well, it's going to be a very difficult process, obviously. The base doesn't have any significant role in U.S. military strategy. Not that that would justify it, but in any case, I think everybody recognizes that the base right now is not significant from a military point of view. We also have, and this I want to emphasize this, since the 1990s, Cuba and the United States have decided, after years of conflict, after years of a very difficult situation at the base, to start the process of confidence-building measures. Now, both sides have tried to create a situation in which we eliminate any possibility of something happening by accident. So, well, this is emphasized. That started in the 90s, well before the agreement of December 17, 2014. But it's obvious that we are in a new scenario. Cuba has put the return of Guantanamo as its #2 demand after the lifting of the embargo or the economic sanctions or blockade, as we like to call it. So Guantanamo is high in the priority list of things that Cuba would like to see solved if we are talking about a real normalization of relations. It's not the only thing. There are 2 or 3 more big problems that require that both countries reach an agreement.
Okay, sir, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us. And that's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at cctv_America. We also use Facebook. Find us at facebook.com/cctvamerica. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.